characteristics of fascism. Militarism. Militarism is another key aspect of fascism as an ideology and is, arguably, a large part of why fascism has been so reviled. The military adventurism of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan are well known, and while Franco's Spain did not engage in this adventurism, the regime was birthed by a coup and a bloody civil war. While militarism is not necessarily unique to fascism, militarism helped fascists to rally support, justify their assertions of power, and overall cement their view of how social forces operated in shaping history. Fascist militarism is the immediate reason why there was a Second World War 20 years after the First. According to the Oxford Dictionary, militarism is defined as, quote, the belief that a country should maintain a strong military capability and be prepared to use it aggressively to defend or promote national interests, unquote. According to Merriam-Webster, militarism is, quote, 1a. Predominance of the military class or its ideals. 1b. Exaltation of military virtues and ideals. 2. A policy of aggressive military preparedness, unquote. Every aspect of these definitions can be seen in fascism, both in its ideology and its policies. Militarism was clearly connected to the territorial ambitions of each of the fascist regimes. For all of the regimes, territorial ambition was connected to a sense of being left out. There was an inherent jealousy of the other great powers and their vast empires in Africa and Asia. Throughout the 19th and 18th centuries, countries were ranked in terms of how many overseas colonies they controlled. Mussolini demonstrates this attitude in his writing, as well as makes a case for why the fascists were particularly suited for the colonial game. Quote, for fascism, the tendency to empire, that is to say, the expansion of nations, is a manifestation of vitality. Fascism is the doctrine that is most fitted to represent the aims, the states of mind of the people, like the Italian people, rising again after many centuries of abandonment or slavery to foreigners. Unquote. It was believed thoroughly by most Europeans that if one wanted one's country to be powerful, one needed to engage in colonial and territorial expansion, an expansion that the fascist regimes felt left out of. France and Britain were clearly the dominant colonial powers, but it was particularly galling for Italy, Germany, and Japan that little Belgium had massive holdings in Africa, and that the Dutch controlled key resources in Indonesia. In Mein Kampf, Hitler described the European colonial system as an inverted pyramid, where the bulk of the territory Europeans controlled was outside of Europe. Both Germany and Italy were rather young countries when compared to their imperial neighbors. Both, for centuries, had been divided into numerous city-states and principalities. It was only in the 1860s that both countries formally became unified. As a result, by the time Germany and Italy began to work towards their colonial ambitions, they looked around and saw that the most valuable territories had already been snapped up. Italy very self-consciously felt left out of the colonial race. Many viewed it as not only a national disgrace, great nations are supposed to have great empires. Italian industrialist Luigi Ferraris said in 1920, quote, Italy needs colonies in order to publicize its level of civilization, but above all to integrate its industry and increase its wealth at home, unquote. For the Italians, this jealousy was motivated by the legacy of Rome, which was directly integrated into Italian nationalism. Mussolini wished to restore the glory of the Roman Empire and return the Mediterranean into an Italian lake. The fascists often used the Roman term mare nostrum, our sea, when referring to their expansionist ambitions in the Mediterranean. Not only was this view propagated by the fascist party and fascist leadership, but it was put forward by lay fascists themselves. In 1921, the fascists laid out the basis of their foreign policy goals. They wished to, quote, reaffirm Latin civilization in the Mediterranean, to impose Italian values on any non-Italians within Italy. The party pledged to become the agents of Italian grandeur throughout the globe, expressed both materially and symbolically, unquote. Echoing this sentiment, fascist supporter Francesco Giunta wished for Italy to take upon its natural role as the first nation in the Mediterranean. He wished for Italy to emulate Rome once more and to dominate the world. Towards these ends, fascist Italy engaged in a series of campaigns in Ethiopia, Albania, Greece, and parts of North Africa. With the assistance of their Nazi allies, Italy hoped to subdue their neighbors and use the sword to restore honor and glory to Italy. For Germany, the sting of colonial jealousy was particularly sharp. Soon after Germany's unification, the Iron Chancellor himself, Otto von Bismarck, helped to organize the Berlin Conference. In an attempt to secure Germany's position in Africa, to formalize the process of imperial expansion, representatives from the major imperial powers met in Berlin from November 1884 to February 1885. Austria-Hungary, Belgium, Denmark, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, the Netherlands, Portugal, Russia, Spain, Sweden, Norway, and the Ottoman Empire were all invited to discuss the matter. While the conference was organized with the expressed purpose of securing colonies for Germany and to make the process of colonization more orderly, the conference invariably declined into what is known as the scramble for Africa. Ultimately, Germany's goals were not achieved, and its colonial holdings remained rather small, while France and Britain's grew immensely. The Nazis, and Hitler in particular, complained loudly and frequently about this state of affairs. They saw it as immensely unfair and unbecoming for a nation-state such as Germany. This sense of injustice was only compounded when Germany lost its meager holdings following World War I. Hitler pontificates about the situation in Mein Kampf and proposes a solution. Quote, "We must, therefore, coolly and objectively adopt the standpoint that it can certainly not be the intention of heaven to give one people 50 times as much land and soil in this world as another. In this case, we must not let political boundaries obscure for us the boundaries of eternal justice. If this earth really has room for all to live in, let us be given the soil we need for our livelihood." Unquote. According to the Nazis, in order for Germany to flourish, its people needed room to grow. Germany needed Lebensraum, living space, in order to become a powerful country. The Nazis looked hungrily towards the lands of those they considered to be racially inferior. Hitler insists that Germany's efforts towards this territorial acquisition would begin in a peaceful manner, but ominously threatened that, if need be, the Nazis would go to war to achieve their goals. Hitler writes, quote, "What is refused to amicable methods, it is up to the fist to take. If our forefathers had let their decisions depend on the same pacifistic nonsense as our contemporaries, we should possess only a third of our present territory." Unquote. For the Nazis, particularly with their racial ideology, war and conflict, expansion and conquest were all part of a Darwinian struggle for existence, an idea that will be explored later in more detail. If the German race did not fight to expand, it would quickly go extinct. Hitler writes of this kind of conquest, quote, "It is our natural determination to fight for our own existence." Unquote. The implication, of course, here is that Hitler truly believes that Germany would cease to exist if it did not grow territorially. Germany would lose its vitality and die if it refused to fight. Using the idea of Lebensraum as a justification, the Nazis initiated aggressive campaigns of expansion against Czechoslovakia, Poland, Denmark, Yugoslavia, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and the Soviet Union. As part of their racial ideology and the need for living space for the Aryan race, during this conquest, the Nazis murdered 11 million people they considered to be inferior. Japan's territorial ambitions were an interesting mix of realpolitik and honest optimism. One can trace Japanese expansionism back to a deep xenophobia, a perceived need for Lebensraum, as well as an idealistic crusade. Japan is a resource-poor nation. There is hardly any coal or iron deposits. This, combined with the self-imposed isolation following the Sengoku Jidai, caused Japan to be at a technological and military disadvantage when compared to its neighbors. This state of affairs proved disastrous for Japan when an American fleet commanded by Matthew Perry arrived in Tokyo Bay. Following a display of modern military strength, Japan was forced to open its markets to the United States and select European empires. This violation of their sovereignty was not something the honor-bound culture of Japan would soon forget. In order to make sure that such an event never happened again, Japan needed to modernize their government and their military. Under the slogan, "A rich country and a strong military," Japan sought to become a world power. This process of modernization was known as the Meiji Restoration and involved adopting a Prussian-style constitution, Arabic numerals, European styles of dress, industrialization, and accepting European styles of military organization. However, in order to update and strengthen the military, Japan needed to industrialize and mass-produce weapons. In order to do so required resources that Japan did not have access to. Therefore, Japan needed to secure these resources for their own use, i.e., seizing territories outside of Japan. In order to seize foreign territories, Japan needed to modernize and strengthen their military. In many ways, Japan was faced with a vicious cycle of conquest. Also, they would not lose face in front of the Western powers once again. Not only were the Japanese seeking territory in order to harness natural resources for their war machine, Japanese planners were also concerned by their ever-growing population. In much the same way that the Nazis were concerned about Lebensraum, so too were the Japanese. Hida Ikki writes, quote, "There is no doubt that we will need territory in the next 100 years to sustain a population of at least 240 or 50 million." Unquote. The irony of this, however, is that in 2019, Japan's population was 126 million and is declining. Similar to Italy and Germany, Japan was also largely jealous of the imperial holdings of their Western competitors. Ikki writes plaintively, "Britain, astride the whole world, is like a very rich man, and Russia is landlord to half the northern world. Doesn't Japan, which is like a propertyless person in an international society confined to these small islands, have the right to go to war to overthrow their domination in the name of justice?" Unquote. Japan felt as if they received no respect from their peers. The Russo-Japanese War, for instance, was the first time in the imperial age that an Asian country defeated a European power on the field of battle. Not only did Japan defeat the Russians militarily, the defeat was so devastating that it almost caused the collapse of the Tsarist regime. Despite this, the terms of the peace treaty did not acknowledge the Japanese as equals. Furthermore, when Japan assisted the Allies in the Pacific theater of World War I, they expected a handsome territorial reward. Instead, they were shunted aside, causing many Japanese to feel as if they had been swindled by the Treaty of Versailles. Versailles' effect on Germany is well known, but it is of interest to note that Italy was likewise promised territory when the war was over, an offer that was quickly scrapped. Connected to this jealousy was Japan's stance against Western imperialism. Japan saw itself as the natural protector of East Asia from the ravages of European colonialism. Ikki writes, quote, "Our 700 million brethren in China and India have no way of establishing their independence without our aid and help." Unquote. Japan knew full well of Western meddling in Asian affairs, yet they were one of the few East Asian countries to maintain their independence. Japan wished to create what they termed the Greater East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere, a quasi-alliance of East Asian countries who would cooperate economically to directly compete with Western Europe. Japan envisioned itself at the head of this coalition, acting as an older brother to guide the children of Asia. This vision of colonial liberation factored heavily into Japanese propaganda throughout the Second World War. What this became in practice, of course, was merely the same imperial relationship, but with Japan replacing the French, Dutch, and British. Furthermore, militarism paired quite easily with Japanese culture. As was mentioned previously, Japan has had a long martial tradition, specifically focused upon the samurai. Bushido culture was instilled into children in schools throughout Japan. A fanatical reverence for the emperor, a suicidal quest for honor on the field of battle, a Neo-Confucian deference to authority taken to the extreme. This could best be exemplified by the kamikaze pilots, who would deliberately crash their fighter planes into enemy ships. It could further be seen by the fact that the imperial army would often fight to the last man, surrender being deeply dishonorable. The Japanese saw themselves as victims and as liberators. They believed that the only way to right the wrongs done to them was to pick up the imperialist mantle. Icky concludes his pamphlet by writing, quote, "On the road to heaven, there is no peace without war." Unquote. Not only was militarism a key component of the fascists' territorial ambitions, it was also a key part in understanding how the world worked and how history progressed. The view was essentially that, throughout history, military prowess decided the fates of nations and determined which countries and cultures would be dominant and which would be subservient. If Rome had not been a military force to reckon with, no one would remember their names. They would have been snuffed out by Carthage or by any of their other rivals. Conflict determined which cultures would survive and flourish, and which would perish into squalor and ignominy. Not only did this, but military conflict helped to hone the strengths of the victors and expose the weaknesses of the vanquished. Those who could adapt and learn would be the ones to survive. In such a world, if an empire was not growing, it was dying. Like a shark, the nation-state must swim ever forward. Mussolini writes, quote, "The nation as the state is an ethical reality which exists and lives in so far as it develops. To arrest its development is to kill it." Unquote. For the fascists, not only was this a mere observation of how history operates, but rather a desirable state of affairs that moves society forward. When combined with the scientific theories of the 19th century, particularly Darwinism, this idea took on racial qualities that were to help define Nazism as an ideology. In the same way that natural selection applies to organisms, so too does survival of the fittest apply to nation-states. The fascists very directly thought of society and the state as organic, the individuals within them acting as cells in the body. This concept is very much dialectical and Hegelian in nature, thesis coming into murderous conflict with antithesis, to create synthesis wherein the strengths are combined and refined, while the weaknesses are shunted aside. Perhaps this is another reason why fascists and communists have been so at odds with one another. They each had a competing dialectical view of how history developed. For the fascists, it was the conflict between states. For the communists, it was the conflict between economic classes. Kita Icky acknowledges this conflict directly. Quote, "I can positively say that there is no denying that a society progresses through class war. But what is this so-called social science that closes its eyes to wars between people and wars between nations that have taken place since the beginning of mankind?" Unquote. Not only did militarism help to explain historical development as well as play a key part in domestic and foreign policies, for the fascists, there was an inherent moral component to militarism. Conflict, particularly military conflict, helps to bring out the best virtues of mankind. A young man working as a grocer has little opportunity for bravery. He has little opportunity for brotherhood and discipline and honor. Put that same young man in a uniform, drill him, give him a fraternity of similar young men, and one would be surprised to what heights of virtue that young man could climb. This view is directly expressed by General Helmuth von Moltke. Von Moltke was the chief of staff of the Prussian and German military, a brilliant military commander. He orchestrated the victories against Denmark and Austria, and that helped to form Germany into a modern nation-state. He also led the German army in the humiliating defeat of France in 1871. France's defeat was so devastating that Emperor Napoleon III himself surrendered to Bismarck in person and was subsequently captured. He had to abdicate the throne and spent the rest of his life under house arrest. This caused the collapse of the Second French Empire, the brief but bloody uprising of the Paris Commune, and the beginning of the Third French Republic. Arguably, if it was not for Otto von Bismarck and Helmuth von Moltke, there would not be a German nation-state as we know it. In a letter to a colleague in 1880, von Moltke laid out his perspective about war as a good and necessary aspect of life. Quote, "Eternal peace is a dream, and not even a beautiful one. War is part of God's world order. Within it unfold the noblest virtues of men, courage and renunciation, loyalty to duty, readiness for sacrifice, at the hazard of one's life. Without war, the world would sink into a swamp of materialism. Unquote. While von Moltke was not a fascist, the fascists would certainly agree with this sentiment. Mussolini writes, quote, "War alone brings up to their highest tension all human energies and puts the stamp of nobility upon the peoples who have the courage to meet it." Unquote. In Imperial Japan, soldiers were seen to be more sincere and more virtuous than civilians, politicians, or the wealthy businessmen. Connected to the virtues that military conflict allows people to access within themselves, there is also a sense of unity as well as equality inherent in the experience of conflict. In the trenches, soldiers found camaraderie that is very much lacking in civilian life, a camaraderie that has defied any and all social and economic hierarchies. Bullets do not care if someone is rich or poor. Landmines do not stop from exploding if the person who activates them is a descendant of aristocrats. Poison gas does not become deadlier if someone is the son of a cobbler. The same goes for every aspect of combat. Artillery shells, razor wire, torpedoes, flamethrowers, hand grenades, knives, clubs. None of the accoutrements of the First World War, or any conflict, has any sense of class or social consciousness. On the front lines of Verdun, or the Somme, or the Marne, the tools of war care not about one's background. The rich and the poor are equally in danger on the front line. This shared wartime experience helped to foster a sense of nationalism and unity against the common foe. All of us in this trench are German, and we are fighting against the enemy in the opposing trench, who is British or French or Russian. This sense of fraternity found in the shared experience of war can be seen throughout the writings of nearly every veteran of the First World War, and in the writings of the fascists in particular. It was an experience that reinforced their sense of national identity, their sense of group identity, as distinguished from non-veterans, as well as their own personal identities. Not only was military conflict seen as rejuvenating for the individual participants, it was also seen as a, quote, therapeutic and regenerative, unquote, for the nation-state itself. Giovanni Gentili believed that the First World War had provided an answer to, quote, a profound spiritual crisis, unquote, that was affecting Italy. Angelo Amico, a veteran of the war, spoke of spiritual unity that the war brought to the people of Italy. The fascists had a particular contempt for those who had not fought in the First World War. According to their propaganda, when it came to military conflict, men had to choose, quote, between heroism and cowardice, idealism and selfishness, unquote. Furthermore, they had contempt for the doctrine of pacifism. They believed that renunciation of violence would necessarily lead to the downfall of society. The state and the nation would lose its vitality. Mussolini writes, quote, "Fascism believes neither in the possibility nor in the utility of perpetual peace. It thus repudiates the doctrine of pacifism." Unquote. The famous pacifist novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, by Erich Maria Remarque, was adapted into a film in 1930. At a screening of this film in Berlin, members of the SA released white mice into the audience. The act caused such a disturbance that the screening was interrupted and canceled. Women screamed in fright at the mice, and their Nazis, quote, roared with laughter, unquote. Remarque's novel would later be banned by the Nazi regime. It, and other pacifist books like A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway, were burned en masse by the brown shirts. Dietrich Eckart is reported to have commented, quote, "We need a fellow at the head who can stand the sound of a machine gun. The rabble need to get fear into their pants. We can't use an officer because people don't respect them anymore. The best would be a worker who knows how to talk." Unquote. Not only do Eckart's words demonstrate the contempt the Nazis held for non-veterans, let alone pacifists, but also connects back to the idea of populism. The Nazis wanted a sergeant or a corporal, not an officer who would likely be from the upper classes. Similarly, Ernst Junger, author of The Storm of Steel and The Struggles as an Inner Experience, advocated for, quote, a state of the frontline soldiers, unquote. While Junger distanced himself from the Nazis throughout their reign, his books were used extensively for propaganda, and his views on military service complemented Nazi militarism. Furthermore, one can see here how militaristic attitudes directly undermined liberalism and democratic institutions. For Hitler, militarism was multifaceted and touched upon the other key planks that the Nazi Party stood upon. He writes in Mein Kampf, quote, "In August 1914, the whole Jewish jabber about international solidarity had vanished at one stroke from the heads of the German working class, and in its stead, only a few weeks later, American shrapnel began to pour down the blessings of brotherhood on the helmets of our march columns. It would have been the duty of a serious government, now that the German worker had found his way back to his nation, to exterminate mercilessly the agitators who were misleading the nation. Instead of this, His Majesty, the Kaiser himself, stretched out his hands to the old criminals, thus sparing the treacherous murderers of the nation, and giving them a chance to retrieve themselves." Unquote. In a remarkably short passage, Hitler touches upon nearly every single part of the Nazi ideology, all within the context of praising the virtues of militarism. Anti-Semitism, nationalism, populism, authoritarianism, and a scathing critique of the nobility. Here we see that Hitler believed that the upsurge of militaristic and nationalist fervor in the early days of the First World War directly challenged the so-called Jewish conspiracy to undermine the Aryan race. Further, it undermined communist hopes of internationalism by pulling the working and lower classes to defend the German Reich. Connected to this, he is directly critiquing the government of Kaiser Wilhelm II, because, according to Hitler, the German government did not do enough to silence dissenters. Ultimately, though, the focus of this passage is upon the positive impacts Hitler claims the first days of World War I brought to Germany, the sense of unity and brotherhood that the war essentially forced upon those who participated. Militarism on its own is not necessarily fascist. There have been many people who have praised the merits of military values as well as advocated for aggressive foreign policies without being fascists. European nations in the decades before 1914 all extolled the virtues of military service, the honor of dying for one's country. The height of the European empires as well before the First World War, arguably in the 1880s, many of these territories were taken and subsequently controlled by powerful militaries. As mentioned previously, Helmuth von Moltke was not a Nazi and died 50 years before Nazism came to power, and yet he was also extolling militarism. To give one more example to demonstrate the point, one can look to the United States. Theodore Teddy Roosevelt was arguably the most bombastically militaristic president in United States history. A lawyer from a wealthy family, Teddy served in the New York State Assembly, ran for mayor of New York City, and was elected governor of New York. Throughout his life, he was known as a great outdoorsman, a cowboy, and a hunter. And from these experiences, he developed his own particularly code of manly virtue. A key part of that sense of virtue, was militarism. Roosevelt was one of the biggest believers in the expansion of the United States and of the United States intervening around the world to defend American interests. Roosevelt once wrote, quote, "The most righteous of all wars is a war with savages, though it is apt to be also the most terrible and inhuman. The rude, fierce settler who drives the savage from the land lays all civilized mankind under debt to him." Unquote. Roosevelt once sent Senator Henry Cabot Lodge a Rudyard Kipling poem, saying that it was, quote, "poor poetry, but good sense from the expansionist standpoint." Unquote. Roosevelt was enthralled by expansion and war. A friend of Roosevelt's in 1885 described him by saying, quote, "He would like above all things to go to war with someone. He wants to be killing something at all times." Unquote. The philosopher William James described Roosevelt saying that he, quote, "gushes over war as the ideal condition of human society, from the manly strenuousness which it involves, and treats peace as a condition of blubber-like and swollen ignobility. fit only for huckstering weaklings, dwelling in a gray twilight and heedless of the higher life. Unquote. Admittedly, this description comes from one of Roosevelt's harshest critics, but even from Roosevelt's own words, one can see his fascination with militarism. Roosevelt echoed von Moltke when he said, quote, "The courage of the soldier, the courage of the statesman, who has to meet storms which can be quelled only by soldierly qualities. This stands higher than any quality called out merely in time of peace." Unquote. But besides extolling the virtues of soldiering and the discipline that it instilled in young men, Roosevelt seemed to have believed that it would be a positive good if the United States were to go to war. In 1897, Roosevelt wrote a friend saying, quote, "In strict confidence, I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one." Unquote. Roosevelt added to the sentiment further on a separate occasion, quote, "Frankly, I don't know that I should be sorry to see a bit of a spar with Germany. The burning of New York and a few other seacoast cities would be a good object lesson in the need of an adequate system of coast defenses. And I think it would have a good effect on our large German population to force them to an ostentatiously patriotic display of anger against Germany." Unquote. In 1898, Roosevelt's enthusiasm for war was put to the test in a conflict with Spain. Roosevelt was so keenly interested in the Spanish-American War that he resigned from his position as Assistant Secretary of the Navy so that he could form his own combat unit. A motley assortment from all parts of the country, Roosevelt led his Rough Riders with enthusiasm. The unit's greatest accomplishment, the Battle of San Juan Hill, wherein 100 Americans were killed and 1,000 wounded, was described by Roosevelt as, quote, "the great day of my life." Unquote. His wording here should be specially noted. He seems to be stating here that this particular battle was the greatest day of his life. Not one of the greatest days, but the greatest. It was during this battle that Roosevelt shot a Spanish soldier in the back with a revolver. After the battle was over, Roosevelt excitedly penned a letter to a friend saying, quote, "Did I tell you that I killed a Spaniard with my own hand?" Unquote. Roosevelt was elected the 26th President of the United States in 1904 and used the position with zeal. In a speech at the Minnesota State Fair in 1901, then Vice President Roosevelt outlined his perspective on foreign policy. Quote, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Unquote. It was important for a nation to be militarily strong, lest its interests be challenged. One famous example of this big stick policy was sending the modernized U.S. fleet on a tour around the world, ostensibly to promote peace, but in actuality to intimidate rivals. Another famous result of this kind of foreign policy was the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which drew a line in the sand around the Western Hemisphere. The United States would not tolerate any European power interfering with Latin America. If a European nation would try to do so, it would require, quote, "intervention by some civilized nation, and in the Western Hemisphere the United States cannot ignore this duty." Unquote. Roosevelt was essentially claiming the whole of North and South America for the United States' sphere of influence. Roosevelt maintained this attitude throughout his life. 2 years before he died, the United States was beginning to mobilize to enter the First World War. Roosevelt gave a speech to the Harvard Club in which he described those opposed to the U.S. entering the war as, quote, "a whole raft of sexless creatures," unquote. They lacked the vitality to do their manly duty. The point here is to demonstrate that merely being a militarist does not make one a fascist. But one can hardly be considered a fascist if one is not a militarist.